My name is Kathy Jacobs, and I'm the director of the Center for Climate Adaptation, Science and Solutions here at the university. And we are extremely pleased to host today our guest speaker, Kyle Whyte. He is a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. Did I do that okay? And holds the Timnick Chair in the Humanities at Michigan State University. He's Associate Professor of Philosophy and Community Sustainability, a faculty member of the Environmental Philosophy and Ethics Graduate Concentration, and a faculty affiliate of the American Indian Studies and Environmental Science and Policy programs. So it sounds like you go to a lot of meetings.
I just skipped them and apologize later.
Right. That's sort of what interdisciplinarity is all about. But anyway, he has been part of numerous policy, coalition building, and educational initiatives supporting Indigenous peoples' capacities to address climate justice. One of the reasons we're extremely happy to have him here is our Native Nations Climate Adaptation Program is focused on many of these same topics, and we're thrilled to see how many of you are here today. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you so much, Kyle. And so we'll let you take it away from here. And will you take questions afterwards, or how would you like to set that up?
Oh, I have a choice.
Well, sure. It's on you.
I'll take questions after.
Okay, great. All right, thanks.
Great. That'd be kind of funny if I said no. I ain't gonna take questions afterwards. All right, bonjour, Kyle Whyte and Dejnakas, Bodwadmi and Dao, Jijak and Dodem, Shishi Banek and Abinda Gwes. I just told you I'm Kyle, I'm Potawatomi, Crane Clan, I'm Potawatomi of the Oklahoma variety. I'm a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, which is a federally recognized tribe right in the center of Oklahoma. And I really feel honored to be here. I've been an admirer of all of the great work that the traditional custodians of what's now called Arizona are doing, from the TO's TOCA program to the Dene Policy Institute up north. And so, you know, it's really great to connect face to face with so many folks here whose work I've admired for a long time. In this presentation, this is a super duper crash course on how Indigenous people in North America, but also elsewhere, have addressed this topic of climate change. And especially this issue of climate justice, which has to do with this very basic idea that as Native people, it wasn't our businesses and projects that led to what we call anthropogenic climate change, or the rise in global average temperature that's largely being brought about by industrial activities and deforestation of settler societies. But even though we didn't really cause it, we're actually among the populations that are going to experience harms, possibly from the climate destabilization, the warming, the changes in precipitation patterns, the more extreme weather events that are projected by scientists to occur, and for some people are already occurring. So I wanted to give you all a rundown, and it's largely coming out of my work, but also the work of others who I've connected with, so that if you're in the humanities or the sciences or whatever field you're in, if you're working for a tribe, there's a little bit in this presentation for everybody. And so I'm going to shift from looking at, you know, different social, political, and historical issues to talking specifically about climate science, to then getting into this nutty idea of the Anthropocene that I know has been going around for a while. So to begin with, you know, as a Potawatomi person, you know, why is it that I'm interested in climate change? And so this is my tribe. And ever since, you know, I can remember, I was always interested in the fact that for us, our governing system was a seasonal governing system. And so Potawatomi people are part of the larger Anishinaabe group, so that includes Ojibwe and Odawa people. And our entire way of governing ourselves was based on the ecology of the Great Lakes region. And we developed a highly seasonal system, and it wasn't like the United States that has the same governmental structure all year round. Our government shifted at least 13 different times during the year to adjust to seasonal change. And you can see, right, that these different moons, this is our 13 moon system, you know, oftentimes the moons are named after particular activities like ricing or berrying. And literally the society changed and adapted to be a different type of institution, whether political authority was based in a nuclear family or was based in a larger band structure. We designed a society that was highly sensitive to the dynamics of ecosystems. And so for us then, right, even the language was based on referring to things based on what part of the ecological cycle they were in during the year. And so the language itself was very adaptive to environmental change. And so in my work, I was very fascinated by the idea that actually for Native people, the concept of your society being organized and structured to reflect or to approximate the dynamics of ecosystems is not really a new idea for us. And so many tribes, right, whether it's through their star maps or their seasonal calendars, this is from the Koyukon in the Arctic, have these governing systems that are based on seasonal change. And it's also the case that if you're a society that is concerned with adjusting to the dynamics of ecosystems throughout the year, you are probably also a society that tries to remember trends that are happening interannually across years, over decades of time, over 100 years of time. And so for that reason, I've also been fascinated with how Indigenous people had a sense of climate and having to adjust and adapt your society to seasonal trends. So this is the Lakota winter counts, which are actually records that these folks kept each year of major events that were occurring, some of which were meteorological events, some of which were environmental events. And so when we talk about climate change for Indigenous people, right, this is a Nez Perth seasonal round, we're not talking about a new concept per se, because Indigenous people have always been interested in environmental change and in also broader climate change. Of course, Indigenous people in a North American context got exposed to another kind of climate change through the experience of US settler colonialism. And so this is where we get into what many people call anthropogenic climate change or human-caused climate change, which is when one society does things that impose climate change on another society. So for my tribe, for example, we went from that Great Lakes-based system, and we were forced to march in the 19th century all the way down to Kansas and eventually to Oklahoma. We ceded this huge area of land, which was part of our original Great Lakes governance range, and took the Trail of Death, ended up in Indian territory, right? Big difference. They put a lot of the Great Lakes tribes right in the center of what's now the state of Oklahoma. And I don't know if have you all been to Oklahoma before? It's not, yeah, not the prettiest place, is it? Some parts are, right? But, and then they found a little oil there. We had at least thought, I think, that, man, nobody's ever gonna mess with us down there. But then when they found oil and they wanted to settle it eventually, then we again went through another process of dispossession. And so in this map, you'd think, oh, the gray area, that's the area that we're sovereign over, but it's actually the little orange boxes. That's the land that we have left that we're sovereign over in Oklahoma. That's our trust land. And the purple land is the land that we own in fee. And the rest of the land has been entirely dispossessed. So the experience of relocation brought about two different kinds of climate change. One is that we literally had to adjust from one climate region, the Great Lakes, to another in a very short period of time. Another kind is, even though we had originally this reservation there, this area of land where we were supposed to have jurisdiction, now it's been divided up, fractionated, and checkerboarded to such an extreme degree that that's also a form of climate change, because you have to adapt to environmental change based on the land that's available to you, based on the land that you have sovereignty over. And so that is also a climate change issue, because it's a limitation on the types of actions we can take with respect to the environment, and on a number of issues, from climate adaptation to environmental protection. And so for me, being from a tribe that's been through this experience, and all tribes have these stories of having to go through different types of human-imposed climate change. I've also been very fascinated with what it meant for us to rebuild our society from, almost from scratch, right, in a completely new area. And so, today there's almost 30,000 of us. We have an economy based on multiple businesses and enterprises and a diverse citizenry that's, people of all different religions now are members of the tribe, people from all different walks of life. They've all across North America, though many still live in Oklahoma. And what I found was interesting is that even though we had to adapt to a new climate region, we still drew on traditions that we learned in the Great Lakes to guide how it is that we rebuilt our government in this new land. And so, for me then, it's been this experience of understanding, what is it that our ancestors, the principles and ideas from our previous culture in the Great Lakes region were teaching us about how it was to rebuild ourselves in this completely different environment. And so now, having gone through all this, Potawatomi people, we've been scattered all over the place. This is us down here at the bottom, but we've got folks all the way into Ontario and Wisconsin. And so we've also attempted to rebuild ourselves, and we have an annual gathering in which all the different groups meet at somebody's jurisdictional area or reservation or nation and talk and celebrate what it is to be Potawatomi, even though we've gone through all of these issues. And so again, this is an issue of what it means to adapt to massive environmental change and how it is that as Native people, we both engage in new activities, but also draw on principles from our history in order to figure out how to rebuild our nations, given all that we've been through. So given that Potawatomis are stretched all over the place, and I still haven't figured out who did this map, but it's not entirely accurate. But if you look at kind of the middle section, that's how Anishinaabe people, including Odawa and Ojibwe people, have been sort of divided up and fragmented and spread all over the place. And so when I went into academia, and my partner, Christy, she got a job at Michigan State University, which is literally right in the middle of area my ancestors ceded to the United States. That was when I was like, do me a solid, take me with you. I want to work in that region. I want to go back to that area and be part of those environments and ecosystems that gave rise to our culture. And then in Oklahoma, I'd only learned about, or for folks that were raised in California or other parts of the U.S. who are Potawatomi, right? We'd only learned or heard about these types of habitats and environments and the social relationships and cultural relationships that you can only practice in those particular types of context. And so it's been great for me to get a chance to sort of learn firsthand about not only what these plants and animals are actually like, but the things that you can do with them. And that created many of the different principles and stories and memories that we have as Potawatomi people. And then to see and be influenced by many of the activism around the environment that Anishinaabe people were taking. This is the Mother Earth Water Walk, which is one of the largest indigenous environmental movements. And so just as I was getting into all of this stuff, right, and relearning aspects of my culture I'd only heard about, then I met some climate scientists. And not knowing any of this stuff about me, they were telling me, a good way to understand climate change in Michigan is like in 50 years or more, it's going to become like Oklahoma. And you can imagine, from an indigenous studies and decolonial perspective, especially after I found out that actually the climate change that was going to make Michigan like Oklahoma was significantly brought about by industrial activities that were facilitated by settler colonialism, which dispossessed my tribe and moved us out of the way. And I was like, really, they're just trying to, get every single Anishinaabe tribe into Oklahoma. And the first wave, right, were the ones they sent through the military, and now they're going to do it through the climate system, right? So that we'll all be in Oklahoma in some sense in the future. And so there I was realizing that, yeah, if that climate changes like that, then all of these plants and animals and habitats that I was getting to know for the first time in a strange sense would actually eventually all be gone. And so plants and animals would be moving to Canada, and we wouldn't have access to them anymore, especially because the Potawatomi people on the Ontario side have very small jurisdictional areas or lumped in with other tribal groups, with other First Nations. And so it's like just as I was getting there, then once again, everything was almost like moving away. And it was kind of a deja vu experience because as Potawatomi people, we'd been through so much environmental change and climate change before, going back to our origins as people, that it was, important for me to kind of come to terms with that reality that, again, part of what I needed to do as somebody that was interested in supporting my tribe and tribal sovereignty and other Potawatomi people was to figure out how it is that we can deal with environmental change without incurring harms to our communities. And without having to adapt at a pace that will ultimately not be good for our health, our cultural integrity, and our well-being. And so that led me to find out whether it was just Anishinaabe people that were the only ones that were thinking about climate change. And it turned out, right, that Native people everywhere in the US context and on the Canada side, Indigenous people across the world were also pretty concerned about climate change. And numerous, scientific reports, from the IPCC to the Arctic Climate Assessment were talking about the impacts that Indigenous people were going to face, and they range widely. Alaska Native villages, and there are dozens of them, are having to figure out whether they should relocate due to impacts like sea level rise. There are tribes that are concerned that increased severity of extreme weather events is going to affect their infrastructure. There are tribes that are worried that warming is going to affect the habitat of both culturally and economically significant plants and animals. And so you have impacts, kind of the first 3 or 4, that are of that type, sort of immediate climate change impacts that you have to adjust for. But then also when I was looking more at what Native folks were saying, more about what tribal leaders were saying, and some scientists too, you were finding that there were sort of deeper, almost more stressful types of connections with climate change. So for example, in some tribes where there might be a few elders within that tribal community that are mentoring lots of young people about certain harvesting practices, certain traditional practices, if those habitats disappear or those habitats no longer support those plants and animals, then it's not just access to that particular plant or animal that is lost, but it's actually the social connections and the family connections and the cultural connections between elders and young people that were heavily dependent on those habitats. And so the issue is not that as Native people, our societies are only composed of one set of relationships that if they're changed, they're over for good. The idea was that as like any society, if you have to change too quickly, you don't have the time to sort of rebuild and reorganize yourself. And so a lot of elders, especially in the Arctic, were saying, shoot, whereas people used to respect what I knew about the environment as an authority, as an expert, things are changing so quickly that I don't know what my role is going to be anymore in this particular community. And so science has begin to cover these impacts and the issues that Indigenous people are facing more and more. But from kind of a negative perspective, right, kind of a dour perspective, it's kind of like when Vine Deloria wrote that when the anthropologist shows up in the khaki clothes and the hat, then you know that the end times are near. It's like when the climate scientists finally realize that these types of vulnerabilities are occurring, it's like, oh crap, right? Once it dawns on them, maybe it's already too severe. And so I've dedicated a lot of my work to actually trying to document the different climate change issues that tribes face. And it's a pretty complicated story, actually. So on the one hand, right, you have tribes like in the 1836 treaty area in Michigan, which protects fishing rights, that they're concerned that the way the U.S. interprets those treaties is that they're rigid areas where you can and can't go fishing as tribal people, so that climate change, then, if it pushes certain fish populations outside of those rigid areas, then will make it impossible for you to continue fishing particular fish. And so what they're a bit concerned about is not just that, but also that if you look in the records of what they actually negotiated with the United States, they weren't necessarily committed to the idea that the treaty was just about this rigid area that would be protected for fishing, that the treaty would be about annual renewal and renegotiation. Of course, the United States and the state of Michigan are not terribly interested in making a treaty arrangement that's flexible to climate change. And so the tribes who are part of this treaty area are concerned about what they're going to do. Or the Nisquallies, for example, they have a salmon-based economy and culture among other plants and animals, and they're literally watching that glacier, the Nisqually Glacier, recede and recede, which affects the stream temperature, which affects salmon habitat. And they're saying that it's the US and the state of Washington's responsibility to work to stop those types of changes. And so this is one of the situations they're in. The Alaska village of Kivalina, you can see it's on that little sliver island. They're concerned that they're going to have to relocate and are taking actions to figure out what to do due to sea level rise. Of course, the reason why they're on that little island is because the US forced them into that permanent residence in order to make way for a number of other industries and other parts of the colonialism that occurred in Alaska. So it's actually sea level rise is not an impact that historically would have been a huge deal for them because they used to live in a much larger range than just that little island. But then you get other types of issues that come about with climate change that, you have to know a little bit about Indian country to have an idea about, right? So the Oneida tribe, who I work with, they're concerned that back in the day they accepted a form of government that the US thought was acceptable that was organized like a corporate charter. And so instead of sort of that integrated type of seasonal system that I was describing to you all before, they have this now kind of, divided system where you've got an environmental department, a health department, a language department. And they're realizing that climate change is an integrated problem that affects all of these things at one time. And so if you have a government that's divided up into these silos, it's very hard to get folks to work together. And so they're concerned about their capacity to mobilize collectively in an interdisciplinary and interdepartmental fashion to deal with climate change problems that have the types of psychological, social, cultural, and economic impacts that I was describing earlier. And so, when you learn more about these issues that tribes face, they're extremely complicated. It's not just concern with a particular climate change impact. And so those are all North American impacts. But when I've traveled to other parts of the world and connected with Indigenous folks in places that are totally far away from where I'm from, this is a United Nations event on Indigenous diplomacy that I attended for a couple of weeks with about 30 other people, Indigenous leaders. And so hearing from them, right, almost all of them, whether they were from the Pacific, whether they were from Africa, whether they were from Samiland, all different parts of the world had stories about climate change issues that they were facing. And their voices have also been part of this larger climate justice movement that's led to numerous demonstrations, and groups like the Indigenous Environmental Network and the International Indian Treaty Council and many others have been at the forefront to try to show that all of the issues that I was telling you before, all of these vulnerabilities have been brought about by a carbon-based economy that Indigenous people never wanted in the first place. It wasn't their idea. And the colonialism that many of us faced was actually designed to increase these industries in our lands and make them flourish to the point where they increase concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to such a degree that it does impact the climate system and create the destabilization that is helping us, or is making it so that we face some of these issues I described. And so, you can track online the Indigenous climate justice movement. There's been numerous declarations and documents by multiple Indigenous NGOs everywhere based on conferences and meetings, and just way too many of them for me to even talk about here, right? Indigenous groups such as this one that combines Indigenous people from North America and Aotearoa, New Zealand, have a climate change program. And so, Indigenous people all over the place are trying to mobilize in order to deal with climate change and have expressed their voice. And a lot of my work has actually tried to show that whereas oftentimes people in the environmental movement are trying to ask questions like, well, how do we include Indigenous people in environmental conservation or in climate justice? And my point has always been Indigenous people have always been in the environmental movement. We've had our own environmental movements. We've had our own movements, and we've built based on our own ideas and our own histories and our own experiences to address the key environmental problems. And so you can imagine, given what I just described to you, that when I looked at the literature from non-Indigenous people about climate change and vulnerability, I got very, very upset, because what they would do is something like what my friend here did, which I don't think you quite know what he meant here, but they would say, you know what, industrial carbon-based economies destabilize the climate system, and it happens to be through bad luck that some of the worst impacts are visited on poor people, on Indigenous people, on people of color. And so it's really just a case of, you know, of bad luck. And I just got really pissed about that, because it's actually not about bad luck at all, even though that's oftentimes what the dominant discourse says. The reason why as Native people we're more vulnerable to climate change is because we've been through years of sedimented environmental change and domination at the hands of more powerful private and public entities, right? Nation states, colonial states, corporations, that has actually made it so that the climate change impacts we're experiencing today are more extreme than they would have been historically. In fact, a huge chunk of climate change impacts that we deal with today wouldn't have been a problem back in the day. So for example, take in Michigan, black ash basket making, which is based on harvesting the black ash tree. And so black ash trees have been threatened for a long time by an invasive species called the emerald ash borer. Climate change didn't bring about the emerald ash borer, but climate change makes the habitat for the emerald ash borer a lot nicer for it. And so climate change then exacerbates the loss of black ash trees, which then exacerbates the loss of the basket making tradition, which is part of the fabric of Anishinaabe people's society. Of course, back in the day, some of these issues that we're facing are based on the fact that the black ash habitat was already reduced, because in the 19th century in Michigan, they deforested the whole state and they drained most of the wetlands. And ash trees are in the wetlands. And so the deforestation and drainage basically reduced access to black ash trees from the beginning, so that the remaining areas of habitat that we have left are now threatened by this invasive species and climate change. So to understand Indigenous vulnerability, you can't just look at it as, oh, it's bad luck that climate change happens to affect black ash habitat. You have to understand that the reason why that habitat was vulnerable in the first place, from a perspective of Indigenous access to it, was because of years of sedimented colonialism that changed the hydrology, that changed the ecological systems, that changed the habitats. No different from fishing. Why are we worried about the sensitivity of fishing areas to climate change? Well, at least in the Great Lakes, the settler society polluted the hell out of the Great Lakes through numerous industrial processes, which were also ones that over time caused climate destabilization, and that already limited the places we could go fishing. And so that when we're talking about certain areas where we can go fishing being affected by climate change, we're already talking about places that were greatly limited by a number of colonial activities that we did not consent to. And of course, relocation, you know, for tribes like mine, one of our biggest issues with adaptive capacity is that we've only been living in the area where we're at for a very short time. So we're actually just learning from scratch how the environment works there. And so we don't have the type of knowledge base that we would have had in the Great Lakes region. But then relocation also refers to the having to take on reservation areas. Most tribes who have reservations will say that one of their biggest climate change issues is how to adapt to change in such a small boxed-in reservation area. And so if you look at this map where the colors are the larger treaty areas, which correspond to the overall historic ranges, even though they're a little bit on the small side. But the red areas are the reservations. And you can see they're a fraction of the size of the total habitat range that those tribes were living within, were governing themselves within. And so obviously that's going to make it very hard to adapt. And if you look at the history of treaty making and statutes and so on with the United States, you'll find that tribes were actually, at least some, were very aware that the reservations were too small to support their lifestyles, which is why many tribes tried to secure off-reservation treaty rights to hunt, fish, trap, worship in areas that you'd ceded, but that you required to continue a particular way of life. So it's not, something that is based on bad luck. And I think for this reason, you can see that when Native people address climate change, they don't address it from a bad luck perspective. They address the entire issue. So take the tribes in Western Washington, the Stevens tribes, because they all signed a treaties called the Stevens Treaties. So they produced a document, and this is part of their climate justice movement, called Treaty Rights at Risk. What it's trying to claim is that salmon populations, and most of these tribes are based in some way on salmon economically, culturally, and in other ways too, that the United States has allowed all sorts of private and publicly endorsed activities that are threatening salmon habitat. Some of these activities are also related to climate change that is causing other issues that affect habitat. And the United States, through its treaty relation, only feels it's responsible for protecting those fishing jurisdictions. And so these tribes are reminding them that both if you look in the minutes of treaties, but if you also just think logically about what a treaty would have protected from a tribal perspective, that the United States' responsibility is to protect the overall habitat required to have a flourishing salmon population. And so what they're actually trying to do then is get the US to realize that they violate their treaty obligations when they aren't attending to the larger habitat and ecological issues that are required for the tribe to be able to continue that salmon tradition. But at the same time, right, while these tribes are making the point that salmon is absolutely vital to their culture and way of life, these are also tribes like the Lummies who have been the biggest vocal opponents of the fossil fuel industry, right? So a lot of the transportation areas for shipping, fossil fuels, coal, gas, oil, run through their lands. And so they've been very adamant that these shipments are unacceptable. And what they're doing in this climate justice activism is both holding the United States accountable historically for its treaty obligations, right? Attempting to decolonize the treaty obligation. But at the same time, they're also fighting against this connection between the fact that historically, when the US reneged on its treaty obligations, that was done to make way for these fossil fuel-based industries. And so really to understand the Indigenous climate justice movement, there's no distinction between mitigation and adaptation, right? When Indigenous people seek to address the impacts of climate change, they're seeking to stop the laws, the policies, the practices that brought about, in the first place, the fossil fuel industry and its emergence within North America, and it now has become a major global problem with climate change. And so you can see this activism everywhere. A lot of you have heard about the tar sands issue. Here again, right, the tar sands is a continuation of a fossil fuel-based economy, but it also significantly messes up the land, especially some of the hunting areas of First Nations in that particular region. And so the movement against tar sands has been huge and infectious, right? You can see even white people are getting behind it in their own way. And, it's led partly by Indigenous people and Indigenous people's concerns, right? There's been the movement about the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in the Arctic. Even here more locally, some of my friends that were part of the Dene Policy Institute and produced this food sovereignty, this food sovereignty report. One of the great parts about this report is that it actually addresses the issue of the Navajos' relationship to the coal industry and the importance of thinking long-term about how should the nation's planning occur in ways that are trying to balance the importance of culturally based food systems and health with this long legacy, right? It also goes back to US plans to structure the Navajo Nation government to facilitate extractive industries. And so, the climate justice movement for Indigenous people isn't just sort of in areas explicitly about climate, right? It's also in things having to do strictly with food sovereignty. And so really the diversity of the climate justice movement and the depth and the complexity of how Indigenous people think about climate change, cannot be minimized. And so take, the issue that many of us have been working on recently, the Dakota Access Pipeline, and the movement to protect water and the movement to protect cultural heritage. It's also partly, maybe not wholly, but it's also partly a climate justice movement. And why is that? Again, it's a similar story, right? So you take a Dakota people who are who are the ancestors of people who are members of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, right? Have this huge area. They have a migratory story and have been for hundreds of years in this area in the plains. Get the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. Of course, they meet Energy Transfer Partners. That's a company that builds pipelines and other things to facilitate the fossil fuel industry. And of course, they're very well backed and financed by multiple banks and financial institutions. And this is the pipeline that they want to put in. And of course, that pipeline is really ugly when you think that for the people in that particular tribe, right? For them, the land is as it is for their culture, right? It's a landscape that reflects who they are, both their ancestors, but also their contemporary practices. And it's also a source of water. And so this is a map that is actually south-oriented of how they look at the area and understand the area according to their own culture and their own way of life. And this is the area that the pipeline is going to go through. And you can see, right, if you look at the different names that they have for the different features of the landscape, right, these are things that reflect an entire history and an entire cultural connection and engagement with that particular area. So the fact that the pipeline is going through that, even if the pipeline is the safest doggone thing ever, and even if no sacred sites were destroyed, it's a scar through a landscape that psychologically and culturally and socially that one requires to be able to live a good life, right? To be able to live a life where you can pursue your own freedom, your own choices, knowing that you have that strong cultural foundation to who you are. And again, right, when we look at this particular issue with the Dakota Access Pipeline, the problem with it is not just that the Army Corps of Engineers, who's the agency responsible for assigning the permits to the builders and the investors in the pipeline, it's not just that their job at consultation wasn't done in a way that was adequate for the tribe. That's just the tip of the iceberg. The problem is that if you look historically, the tribe started off, right, with this much larger area, well over 100 million acres that they had secured in the 19th century based on what they understood to be their needs, given they had a highly adaptive lifestyle, and over numerous treacherous policies. And by treacherous, that's not just me being critical. In the early 80s, the United States actually admitted that one of its most immoral acts was the seizure of most of the land of Lakota Dakota people in this area, right? Including, purely for mining industries, the seizure of the Black Hills, which was never consensual, right? And the Black Hills were a highly and still are sacred area for the people in that land. And so this tribe, in my Dakota Access Pipeline presentations and the papers I've run, I go into this in detail, right? This tribe has been through years and years and years of loss of land and effects to the landscape. So the pipeline itself, right, comes after that and is an additional insult, right, that betrays that larger history. And, if you look at the current situation, I mean, the history of North Dakota doesn't talk about tribal people in South Dakota, but also North Dakota too. They experience racism. This was a political image I found where it was talking about Indian people lining up to vote for a certain politician for the Democrats and use this kind of dogs imagery, which for Oklahoma or Plains, we know what that refers to, right? And it's like racism is widely practiced there. Tribes in that region still, like many Native people, experience lower health outcomes. And so all of this land loss, all of this treachery on the part of the United States, is bound up with this overall history of dispossession. And so by the time we get to the Dakota Access Pipeline, we're dealing with what has been an enormous insult to the very cultural integrity of that landscape. And right, I forgot to say that look what they put in the Black Hills, right? I mean, that's screwed up, isn't it? And so, when people like the Army Corps of Engineers say, oh, the pipeline shouldn't concern the tribe because it's not technically on tribal land. Seriously? that's crazy, right? That's ridiculous, because the tribe never consensually ceded that land and is sacrificed multiple times for the sake of the US economy. And from a tribal perspective, there's no difference from how the US in the 19th century used the military, used the military to facilitate gold prospectors than it is to see, the police and the military facilitating the builders of the pipeline. And so, as you guys know, right, the Water is Life movement created one of the largest mobilizations. It was international, of Indigenous people, and the serious activists, encountered violence, made multiple sacrifices. And I don't know if you saw the recent news, but there was kind of a turn for the worse with the Trump administration. And so they're probably definitely going to build the pipeline segment. And it's going to have some oil coming through it pretty soon. But I think the good news, and I've been speaking about this recently, is that a lot of the legal avenues that the tribe still has available to it potentially could work. It's an issue of religious freedom, issues of treaty rights. And so I hope that everybody, and you can email me if you need ideas of what to do, but there's a tremendous amount of support you could give in the legal actions that the tribe is taking, as well as just building awareness of the history that I've been telling you about. My webpage has a whole bunch of resources on Dakota Access Pipeline. But so here, right, if we're looking at Dakota Access Pipeline and the No DAPL movement in relation to climate justice, right, notice that the issue here is that battling the pipeline is part of this much larger history of tribes struggling just to be treated decently and to have access to the land that's needed to be self-determining societies, both culturally and economically. And so to understand Indigenous climate justice movement, at least in the North American context in the US and Canada, you have to understand that settler colonialism over time has worked to put us in the position that we are vulnerable to climate change issues, and that we're constantly having to address the fossil fuel industry and find ways to stop the fossil fuel industry from doing business and making a profit in our lands, and ultimately supporting those activities that over time, right, contribute to increasing concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so it's a nasty pattern, right? It's reminiscent of all kinds of colonialism, and it's a big part of the environmental justice and climate justice movement for Indigenous people. And so Indigenous folks have been active at the policy level to try to make change. This was an event that occurs every 2 years in Washington, D.C. The first Steward Symposium brings together Native people everywhere around the issue of addressing climate change. It's a great event. You learn about what Indigenous people are facing and doing all over the world. And it leads to things like this document, which I helped to draft, policy principles endorsed by the National Congress of American Indians, right, that seek to improve how the United States engages with tribes on climate change issues. You also get reports like this, which is one I've been part of, that try to sort of change the nature of the conversation with respect to climate change. So for example, as a lot of you guys know, colonialism and gender violence have always been interconnected. Yet none of the climate change vulnerability literature on Indigenous people was taking gender seriously. And so in this particular report, we wanted to bring gender issues to the fore from a tribal perspective. And what I love government reports for is that if they accept what's in the glossary that you provide, that becomes official, like, government language. And so for a lot of Native people, we talk in terms of gender fluidity. And so we got the US government to acknowledge a number of concepts that are important to how we understand climate change, and to the language that a lot of tribes use, right, to understand how gender, colonialism, and climate change are connected. And now these are official terms that at least the Forest Service has to accept. And so Indigenous people have intervened in a lot of these formal government reports, both in the US but all over. And what we've been trying to emphasize in our interventions is this long legacy of climate change, but then also Indigenous capacities to figure out solutions to climate change that they can engage in on their own. And in my work, what I find that even though we've done so much to try to emphasize the role of colonialism within the climate justice, climate injustice, that still it falls on people that don't want to listen to it. So I get comments like this all the time with stuff I write. We're like, why are you talking so much about colonialism? I get no respect, right? But it's part of our education of environmentalists. So to shift gears a little bit and talk something about climate science. So, in all this work that I've been talking about, climate scientists have also realized that as they try to understand climate change better, that Indigenous people know a whole hell of a lot about climate change, actually. And they know things that climate scientists couldn't possibly know because climate scientists haven't lived in particular areas for the long time. And oftentimes they don't come from cultures, at least, that have a memory of environmental stewardship, even if maybe historically they did. And so for Indigenous people, we know a ton about climate change because we oftentimes are part of communities that keep track of seasonal change, right? Keeping track of interannual change, what scientists call baselines. What was the climate like back in the day? And when climate scientists realized this, probably 20 years ago, maybe for some a little bit longer, they jumped on the opportunity to collaborate with tribes. There's one problem. Is that climate scientists often were not used to working with human beings, and they had not learned lessons that people in other fields like anthropology have about the ethical issues of working with tribes. And there turned out to be a whole bunch, right? For many tribes, for example, when they go out and harvest plants and animals, the settler society believes that what they're doing is illegal because it violates a settler law or policy, even though a tribe may never have consented that law or policy. And so that means for tribes, right, a lot of what we're able to, quote unquote, get away with is based on the maintaining of secrets. But if it turns out that somebody who's out there harvesting a lot knows a whole bunch about climate change because they're doing a lot of stuff in secret, if they were to share that information with a climate scientist, the climate scientist were to make that public and publish it like a good scientist does, where you disclose all of your sources of data, then people who would also love to know about where those plants and animals are located and might like to pillage them would find out about that as well. And so there's been a huge mobilization to try to educate climate scientists from an Indigenous perspective about how to work with tribes, given that a lot of climate scientists weren't exposed to that kind of education and ethical collaboration when they were in graduate school or when they were in their postdocs. And so a group that I'm part of called the Climate and Traditionalist Work Group, we produce these ethical guidelines. And all of this stuff is just basic lessons we've learned from other fields about what it means to do ethical research with tribes. And Professor Chief, who's at Arizona, has been a big part of this group as well. And through this, we've learned a lot about, what are the proper ethical protocols for scientists. But actually what we also found out is that that's not enough. And a lot of scientists, even when they understand what the ethical protocols are, that doesn't mean that they fully understand what their connection is, the connection between their work and tribes. And so we've really tried to push the envelope of science education even further, because scientists really need to get clued in as to not only what struggles tribes have faced over many years through colonialism, but also the value of Indigenous knowledge for tribes when they do their own strategies for figuring out how to adapt to change. And so I've been part of a number of groups that have tried to alter how we think about the education of climate scientists. So one I'm part of is Rising Voices, which meets every year, usually at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and it's combined with the Indigenous Peoples Climate Change Working Group. You can see Professor Chief there in the front, and she's been a big part of this collaboration. And so you can see, right, that the topics are intended to engage Native people and non-Native people. But we try to change things up so that scientists have to think about their relationship to tribes in a different way than they've thought of before. So we had our last one in Hawaii and took a day and went up to Mauna Kea, which is not only a major sacred site, but an environmental justice issue, and one associated with a conflict between many Native Hawaiians and tribes. And so the scientists then, who wanted to learn about working with tribes, got to learn firsthand of what the significance is of a cultural landscape. And trust me, this is not the typical thing that you do at a science conference, right? This is not the type of experience that you would typically have, but it's one that, at least I think, gets scientists more in a mindset that can get them to understand the significance of their responsibilities to tribal people. But we also take things a step further. So in my collaboration with the Menominee Nation, we organize events where scientists come to the reservation, the Menominee Reservation, and actually get a chance to understand the full extent of what it means for Menominee people to adapt to climate change and to deal with the climate change issue. So this was our Shifting Seasons Summit, and we had a whole bunch of scientists come, and they got to see firsthand the significance of the Menominee landscape, and the history of the Menominee tribe, the culture, the protocols, the ceremony. Yes, we did some of these scientific presentations, but one of the main things we did right were these dialogues. And so it was a dialogue between scientists and tribes, not sort of a lecture from me or somebody else about what the ethical protocols should be for scientists to avoid exploitation and not incur any liabilities. And so these dialogues are very powerful. People get emotional, and they talk about science collaboration and where it is trying to actually heal, you know, legacies and years of bad connections between scientists and tribes. I wasn't supposed to show you that. Falling asleep when an elder is talking. I kick the white people out when they're... Through these types of interactions, scientists get another sense of what it means for tribes and what they've been through. So the Menominee tribe, again, completely dispossessed of their land. They're on that little box of a reservation. Of course, how come you can see it from outer space? Well, when the Menominee seasonal lifestyle based on hundreds of plants and animals was destroyed, they reinvented themselves in the 19th century as a forestry tribe. When they reinvented themselves as a forestry tribe, they rebuilt a spiritual connection to the forest. And through that, right, the forest has become a vector through which they understand climate change. And one of the reasons why they're a tribe that's reflected the most on how to deal with climate change is because they know what it means to reinvent themselves and to develop that forest. And so they develop their own model of sustainability based on that reflection that in some institutions, some aspects of the tribe use for the basis of planning, right? You can see, you can do pretty complex you know, understandings of climate change through the Menominee model. And so for this reason, I've very much been compelled to lead educational initiatives that try to get people and encourage people that as Indigenous people, we reflect on our own experience and are confronting climate change. We have some great resources on our own. So the Indigenous Planning Summer Institute, which we do every year for tribal college students at Menominee, it's a week long, it's hosted, and it's for students that are interested in climate change planning. And so we spend a whole bunch of time in the Menominee forest trying to understand why it is that the forest is significant for the Menominees being able to think about and act on climate change that might then affect the forest. And by the way, if you've never been to the Menominee Reservation, it has the best powwow ground ever. If you all ever been to the Woodland Bowl? It's pretty sweet, yeah. So definitely go there if you're in the area. But anyway, so in our camp, right, we spend time in the forest. But we also learn how the Menominee turned the forest into a commercial enterprise, but one that supports employment in the tribe and not just one that's about you know, generating profit, right? And I always get pissed when I see this picture, but I'm not pissed at the guy doing the bunny ears. I'm pissed at the guy there that's not doing anything about it. And we visit other tribes in the region, learn about what they're doing, have great discussions. Look, it's the same guy. Doesn't like me very much. And we have discussions about, you know, what it means to draw on our histories dealing with environmental change and climate change in order to best adapt to the changes that are occurring now. And it was funny that even though in these discussions in this camp are a lot about, you know, how do you plan to adapt to climate change, the students, many of the graduates of these camps, through Facebook things I saw, were actually some of the first Native students going way back to like April, right when it started, that were going out to deal with the Dakota Access Pipeline issue. They were among the first people that were going out there to support. And so, again, it's this kind of cyclical idea that adaptation and mitigation for Native people are connected, and it all comes back to these histories of how we've continued to reinvent ourselves in these lands. Another one I do is the Tribal Climate Camp. This is for tribal staff, who oftentimes are not appreciated for all the hard work they do. So we take a week with about 6 to 7 tribes. It's hosted by a tribe. This is Nez Perce, so we got to do some dip net fishing. The camp is run by elders who share all sorts of wisdom about the history of environmental change in the area. Like a lot of stuff I do, we have awesome food. That's always extremely key. We have a good time, share, get to know each other. I have great calves, don't I? And the teams work together to think of solutions from a tribal perspective, right? The elder watching very closely over what they're doing. And instead of like me and other people lecturing to them, we come up with solutions ourselves. We talk to each other, we relate to each other, and it's all done from our own, oops. I wasn't supposed to show you that. I was checking my text messages. But anyways, this is how it works, right? That the solutions that we come up with, their own solutions, and here in this case, right, with the Nez Perce tribe, using their own cultural knowledge, going back to time immemorial, as the guiding framework for how they're going to deal with climate change. And so these are solutions that we come up on our own. We have great graduating tribes, and they do awesome work on climate change after the camp is done. And so a lot of the work I do is trying to mobilize Native folks, right? This is a group called the First Network, which is trying to figure out how to facilitate Indigenous research methodologies, which are community-based methodologies. These are 4 different tricksters. That's kind of the logo of the group. And we have these awesome dialogues with Native people about how to address issues like climate change through research. And Native people generate a lot of notes, right? And come up with a lot of great ideas. And even though these things look totally wacky, they actually turn out to be great guides that are based both on our traditional knowledge, but the things we've picked up over time through having to deal with colonialism. Just when you're in a dialogue, though, with Native people, do not get up to go to the bathroom, because this is what happened to me. I left, and I got assigned jobs. It was in the record, and it was too late. And given these types of solutions that I'm telling you about based on our knowledge and our way of thinking, it's not surprising that tribes have been at the forefront of trying to plan for climate change, right? Tribes have been among the first groups to come up with climate change plans. And so I've been part of a number of teams that are academic and tribal to create climate change plans for tribes, mainly in the Great Lakes, but I've also worked educationally with others, and so with other tribes. And when tribes do climate change plans, they're totally creative. So this is one that I really like. Akwesasne, Mohawk people, Haudenosaunee people, it's their climate adaptation plan. But look how this thing is organized. Look at these categories: Mother Earth, the waters. And so each section, instead of the typical like vulnerability analysis we see in science, begins with aspects of their history, starting in stories, and then finally gets to issues of current conditions, all of course from a tribal perspective. And so this is a climate change plan like no other. And if you look at how different tribes have engaged in climate change plans, they're all very different and are tailored to that tribe's specific culture, history, and needs. So for example, the Salish Kootenai Climate Strategic Plan has a whole huge section with the pictures of elders in it who were able to testify and discuss climate change and give guidance to the tribal staff. Pictures of elders are not typically part of climate change planning. But it's also sort of the basic stuff, like a lot of times climate regions are not designed in ways to give assessments that are sensitive to the jurisdictions that matter to tribes. So tribes have taken leadership on developing climate information that's relevant to treaty areas that don't necessarily correspond to state or county boundaries. And tribes have been presenting, this is Chris Caldwell from Menominee, on how tribes' own models of thinking about sustainability are well suited for climate change adaptation. And so you see this is the Umatilla tribe, understanding climate change through a reconstruction of their food-based culture. Serpent River First Nation created this Turtles Back model based on their own language to understand the impacts both of mining but also of issues like climate change. When I traveled to Aotearoa, I met Kepa Morgan, who created this Maori model, which is a sense of collective well-being for Maori people used to assess climate change impacts, but also many other types of impacts. And so all of these are ways in which Native people are defining what our futures are going to be and thinking about how we want to discuss what the nature of climate change impacts are in our communities and for our people. And so in doing all this work, of course, I was very encouraged about how Native people were taking leadership in defining our own futures and thinking about how we were going to act to deal with climate change issues. And then I saw this concept where people, to me, were almost saying, all of these futures that Native people are designing are not actually the key future, right? The key future is the Anthropocene, which if you don't know a lot about this topic, and I'm not gonna dwell on it too much here while I wrap up, but you know, the Anthropocene is this idea that we've just gotten to this stage where we know now that humans are the primary drivers of environmental change. And from a geological perspective, which is where this concept first came from, that means that in actual sedimentation, right, in the actual stratosphere, you can see the impacts of human society. Of course, people outside of geology have run with this, right? And they've talked about the Anthropocene less as a geology concept, right? But as a concept that's expressing the fact that now humans are this highly dominant group, and that now, you know, humans are screwing up the environment in ways that are irreversible. And so the Anthropocene oftentimes is a way of talking about a dystopian future and freaking human beings out, that if we don't act now and act quickly and act swiftly, then there's going to be so much environmental change, there's going to be extinctions, there's going to be catastrophes, coral reefs, habitats are going to be lost, and that this is the future, right? It's a dire future, and we need a new type of science fiction in order to be able to deal with this future, right? And so what I was realizing is that this is kind of funny because it actually sounds like a lot of white and other people freaking out about things like extinctions and so on, that for tribes we've already faced repeatedly, right? For the average tribe in North America, we went from the capacity of harvesting hundreds of species to literally like sometimes 10 or 15. And while some of those species might not be extinct in a technical sense, losing access to them is kind of like the same thing as an extinction. And so we've dealt with repeated stages of historical loss, extinction-like events. And so the way I look at it is that from a tribal perspective, and this is what I see in a lot of the climate change planning work that we're doing, we're not actually scared of a future dystopia, but we're realizing that the time frame that we're living in right now is a time that our ancestors, were somebody to have told them the tale, would have thought was a dystopia. And so we're actually living in the science fiction scenario. We're not looking at the science fiction scenario. And so using the language of narrative, and this is obviously my kind of more theoretical and kind of literary work, right? You know, I was looking at these ideas about vulnerability, like bad luck that I was telling you about before, and all of those assume, right, that there was some, you know, stationary stage up there in the red of tribal history where we were like hunters and gatherers, and the primary history that we're living in now is the one that starts with the United States, right? And that's kind of the first time that we're experiencing this abrupt environmental change. We're the last cultures that are, you know, surviving in areas of biodiversity, which is funny because even in other parts of the world where you might have the assumption that tribes are living more off the land, those tribes have been devastated too, whether it's in South America, whether it's in Africa, other parts of the world, right? And so from an indigenous history perspective, the red part, right, which is our history, which, by the way, includes all those time periods before the US and Canada when we screwed up each other as tribes and dominated and colonized each other, we see a whole legacy of environmental change, and we've learned all those lessons, and this is the settler period. It's this little tiny period, it's this little sliver of our history that's been highly disruptive. And so this is this period that I'm talking about where somebody who have told our ancestors about it 100 or more years ago, they would have thought that that was a dystopia. And in narrative theory, right, a dystopia is a kind of scenario in which you realize that the conditions of your very collective and individual agency have been curtailed, right? And similar to the Matrix and things like that, you kind of wake up in this environment where you're completely controlled and dominated, and your goal, right, is to find the kinks in the structure and the kinks in the system, and to find a way to be a protagonist, right, to find those protagonists that will know exactly how to undermine the systems of domination that have removed all sense of agency. And so the last thing I wanted to share with you is that actually when I've looked at cases of tribal climate change planning and resilience work, I've actually looked at them at cases where what we're actually trying to do is live out a science fiction scenario, and we're trying to create those protagonists that will save us. And often the protagonists are non-humans. They could be fish, they could be plants and animals. They could be native people, they could be two-spirit persons, right? They're protagonists that the dominant society doesn't accept as solutions to the science fiction scenario, the dystopia that we now live in, right? And by the way, remember, it's not necessarily a dystopia to us. The way that we're acting is it's a dystopia to our ancestors. And this contributes to this idea that as Native people, we're always thinking alongside our ancestors and thinking toward those future generations. So if you don't believe me about the science fiction nature of tribal work on resilience, look at the sturgeon restoration program, which I've done a lot of case study work on for the Little River Band, right? So this is a tribe up in Michigan. They're Anishinaabe, they're Odawa people. And so they're a river tribe. And so all the different fish, the anadromous fish like sturgeon, right, that that reproduce in the river, go out to the big lake, and they remember exactly what stream to go back to. Sturgeon, which you ever seen one, they're massive. And for tribes, these fish were key because when you're coming out of the winter, you depend on sturgeon to replenish your food supply. And sturgeon, at least then, lived longer than humans, and so they're known as the grandfather fish. And there were clans based on sturgeon. And there were particular families that lived in areas that corresponded to specific streams where sturgeon of a specific genetic profile would reproduce when they would engage in their reproductive activities, right, as anadromous fish. And so sturgeon were key, right? But just like many other issues that happened, settler colonialism basically destroyed the sturgeon population through a number of nasty activities, right? And as the sturgeon population declined, the families began to vacate that area. And so the tribal depopulation in the homeland then made it harder for that tribe to exercise sovereignty in an area where there were very conflictive relations between the tribe and the settler population. And so climate change then affecting the remaining habitat that people in the tribe were using, they had to figure out, what is it that we're going to do? And, if you think about that case, right, it already starts kind of in something that our ancestors would have thought of a dystopia, right? Because you're trying to exercise tribal sovereignty in a landscape that from your ancestors' perspective would be like a wasteland, and in which most of the plants and animals that you depended on are completely gone. And so you have to start little by little. You can't start with 600 species. You have to start little by little. Who are the protagonists going to be? And what is important about this case is that the tribe thought that sturgeon would be one of the fish to try to bring back, and that this had to be part of a solution which both increased ecological resilience, but also educated the settler population about who Native people were. So it was a process of reconciliation. But the people who started the sturgeon restoration program knew that it would take over 100 years for the sturgeon to come back to subsistent levels. So bringing back the sturgeon was so epic that the people who were going to put in the hard work to do it would not see the population come back. And so sturgeon then were put as the primary protagonist. And the way that tribes went about this is they drew out their elders, scientists, all sorts of people who historically haven't been protagonists in any kind of tribal drama, right? They've been suppressed. They worked together and they created a weird science fiction solution to dealing with the fact that the small sturgeon that they found, right, the elders helped them find the last remaining sturgeon. When they reproduce, they're too small and the sport fish are going to swallow them up. And so just like in the Matrix, they developed a solution where the protagonists are then almost stored in this lab in these pools, right? So if you're a sturgeon, you wake up in this technological pool, like, where am I, right? This is this, kind of Matrix-like science fiction scenario. But But then once they're big enough, right, they're released back into the river, and the tribe actually created a new ceremony to commemorate the release of the sturgeon. And so the ceremony's got science, it has tradition, and it gets hundreds of people now each year, native and non-native. And after they do the formal ceremonies and cultural aspects, each person gets to take a bucket with a sturgeon in it, whether you're native or non-native, and then actually go and release it, including many children, into the river. And so here, right, each person makes a special connection with sturgeon, right? For tribes, it reaffirms the connection to sturgeon, and people are going back, they're moving back to the area. But non-native people, in the work that I've done, have actually had a transformation in consciousness. They don't think that they're playing Indian, far from it. A couple of people I've talked to have said, we thought when the tribe went to restore sturgeon, you know, we didn't even know they were sovereign. But then also we thought that humans had to put in a lot of effort to save sturgeon. But actually it's sturgeon that are saving human beings, because it's through the life of the sturgeon that humans are coming together and learning about each other's history and actually facing up to this legacy of settler colonialism in the area that has devastated the tribe. And what's interesting is that this is very much about climate change and climate change planning, because these connections between the different people in the area are the ones that are going to lead to the tribe being able to take leadership in a climate change approach to that region, because they have strong relationships now with the settler population. And so here, right, the idea is that, and thinking of getting into this model of kind of protagonists and science fiction, that the way in which a lot of tribes approach conservation is a narrative approach, thinking about who are the protagonists going to be, who are going to be those heroes that are going to bring us back together, that are going to restore social relationships, that are going to allow people in a watershed in a region to be able to have the trust, the communication, the mutual responsibility to be able to work together to address climate change issues that are coming. So like in the Akwesasne climate change plan, that's why it's built around particular plants and animals and cultural connections. Because the idea is that when that plan becomes official in that region, and when they begin to enact and commemorate the plan, it does more than just serve as a tribe's strategy for shifting and moving with climate change, but serves as a larger approach to educate and to bring people together. And so in this presentation, I think you've seen, you know, to understand Indigenous climate justice, it takes us all the way from vulnerability and colonialism, but then to these issues of narrative and science fiction and how Indigenous people engage in creative forms of planning and are really actually setting the tone and setting the pace for what it means to be communities that are prepared for climate change. I look forward to you all's questions.
Well, thank you very much. That was incredible. So do we have some questions out here? Because we have microphones if you have questions.
Hi, Kyle. Thank you for the fantastic talk. I wanted to ask about a kind of a current climate justice solution that's happening, at least in the perspective of old school environmentalists at the Navajo generating station, the second largest emitter of carbon dioxide in the nation, being shut down. And in terms of an environmental perspective, that's great. But then the social justice aspect of having about 900, almost 1,000 Navajo and Hopi people depend on their livelihood depend on the plant and the specific coal mine that produces coal for them. How do you envision a just transition for the people that depend on this greenhouse gas emitting plant?
Great. Thanks for your question. So is this a setup that you're making me talk about Navajo politics in a room where there's a high likelihood that there are many Navajo people? So from my perspective, being from another tribe, and I've actually talked in some of my articles about the situation that the Navajo Nation faces with respect to coal and the fossil fuel industry. But what a lot of environmentalists, non-native environmentalists don't understand is that there is a reason why the Navajo, why the Dene are facing that particular situation. And it goes back to the fact, right, that when the United States was figuring out a better policy for allotment in, the early 1920s and just before that, one of the ideas that came up was that they could turn tribes into corporations that would be organized in ways that would facilitate extractive industries. And guess who the pilot tribe was for that program, which eventually came to be the Indian Reorganization Act in the early 1930s? It was the Navajo Nation. And so the Navajo have had to struggle with the constant pressure of adopting a kind of government which is not their traditional government. And while tribes like my tribe have tried to figure out ways to work with these governments and so on, they still have a number of hurdles, right? Now, why is it that that environmentalists don't talk about? Well, I don't know why they don't talk about these histories, because a lot of the policies which encumber tribes and that limit our governance so that we only have a couple of business opportunities, right? That's why so many tribes go into gaming, because it's almost like we're being embargoed by the United States. We have so many limited opportunities to engage in free enterprise and in businesses that are acceptable to our own communities. But how many environmentalists, when they're doing background lobbying, when they're talking to their Congress people, when they're writing letters, engage in tribal issues that over time will promote conservation, such as policies which will improve the capacity of tribal governments to build themselves in ways that reflect tribal members' values? How many environmentalists do that? Or do environmentalists primarily get involved when there's a big blowout like the Dakota Access Pipeline and they go and force the protest? How many environmentalists do that background work? And what I would like to see, actually, given you were asking about the relationship between that issue and environmentalists, how many of the environmentalists who are upset about the Navajo generating station, do they also in their daily behavior when they're lobbying for other issues that matter to them, are they also seeking to deal at a very sensitive level with the law and policies which ultimately affect tribes' capacities to choose the types of business opportunities that they go into? And so that's my idea for a lot of non-native environmentalists. But that's an excellent question.
It's a kind of an interesting segue into my question, which is really how wide is this North American collaborative effort among the First Nations? And by the way, I just want to thank you. I think the rise of the First Nations and the climate justice movement is an incredibly hopeful sign across the planet, and just so appreciative of you being here telling us these stories. I was in Oaxaca over December and got to witness what the peoples of Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica are doing in terms of organizing around climate change. You can go into the villages, and on the radio, kids are listening to discussions about climate change. But the botanical gardens in Oaxaca are being led by incredible integrative human beings who are putting together the cultural, ethical, economic arguments and working on trade policies, economic development policies, as well as really highlighting the unique plant heritage of Mesoamerica and how that can be a bridge to a climate adaptation in fighting the GMOs in a very effective way.
Yeah, it's a good question, and thanks for your kind comments. So yeah, how well integrated are Indigenous people in their climate justice work? So not enough, actually, but it's not our fault. A climate scientist actually told me, they said, I'm trying to figure out the difference between Indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, and climate science. And I was kind of trying to say, well, they're actually not that different. They're both forms of empirical inquiry that are accountable to the communities who the results matter to. And they said, no, I know a difference. All Indigenous knowledge is local, whereas climate science has the capacity to be both local but also regional through satellite imagery and things like that. And I actually said, well, I understand that point, but that's actually not true, because historically, through trade networks and large continental sets of relationships connecting indigenous people, especially through the supply of goods, right? People are exchanging knowledge, information about different regions. And so the idea of indigenous knowledge that had some sort of regional and continental component, right? Historically, those connections were obviously part of people's knowledge systems. That's not the same as satellite imagery, no, but point being, right, indigenous knowledge is not only local. But what we've really seen is that through colonialism, indigenous people have been taught to be separate from each other, right? So most of us identify with a single tribe that we're enrolled in, and that's actually a legal requirement. But historically, that wasn't true. And identity and membership were much more fluid. And so in the North American context, I see all of these different barriers pop up, right? So oftentimes a tribe that's right next to another tribe, they don't communicate with each other because they're both in governments that are heavily siloed and their staff are overtasked, and so they don't communicate with each other. Or people that do activism work against fossil fuels don't communicate with people working in tribal governments to do adaptation work. We saw them come together in the No DAPL movement, right? But that's rare. To the point where when Native people just spend time with each other and they're from different regions, it can be very emotional because people oftentimes don't get the chance to hear what other people are doing. So while I've organized a lot of events to bring Native people from all over together, and they turn out to be very powerful events, it's still not enough. We still don't coordinate enough. And then globally, it's even worse because while there are Native people that get together at the United Nations, and a lot of activists that go to that repeatedly and reconnect with each other, a lot of the Native people doing the local work don't get a chance to go to those. And they don't have the money or the finances to travel to other parts of the world. So I go a lot to Aotearoa, New Zealand. They have no idea what we're doing in North America. We have no idea what they're doing there. It's taken me like 5 or 6 trips there, literally, to actually just find out who's doing the main climate change work because it's so sort of obscured. And so I think anybody that wants to invest their time and work in Indigenous climate justice, one of the key tasks they can do is be somebody that knows how to bring folks together. So yeah, good question. Thanks for your comments.
I think we have time for just one more.
Hi. Okay. So thank you from me as well. This is really fantastic. My question / comment has to do with what local governments in particular in the U.S. Federalist system can learn from the tribes and other cultures in general. The story you told me about the Oneida tribe and their frustrations with this siloed governmental structure really struck me as echoing what local government, the narrative about the barriers that we face because we're so siloed in our functional domains, and we need to have communication across them in order to achieve sustainability. But we don't really know how to do it because we're so used to this siloed governmental structure. So what are alternatives we can look at? Do you have any stories or other examples that we can turn to?
Yeah, well, I don't have time for another story, but I do have stuff to say on that. Just briefly at a couple of those. So that's a great question, and it's in the U.S. context, that's actually a very important connection related to climate change because so the 565 federally recognized tribes primarily deal with the federal government. That goes back to the Constitution. And that's meant that most tribes don't have great relationships with towns and counties and local forms of government. And oftentimes these forms of government don't consider tribes to be sovereign because these forms of government did not, their initial kind of charters and governing documents don't even reference tribes. And so this means that tribes and municipalities, for example, often don't have a lot of experience working with each other. And actually, Oneida is a very good example of this with the town of Hobart that they haven't had a lot of great relationships with, but they're literally right next to each other. But the problem is that all of the federal jurisdictions are invalidated by climate change because they're too small. So for a tribe to, say, adapt its harvesting or economy based on climate change, it's going to have to be in coordination with the municipalities. But that's kind of like walking into the belly of the beast sometimes because these are parties that have the least experience working with tribes. So in a paper of mine, the one that I always get upset because it's like, I'm very proud of it, but nobody reads it. They read the ones I'm less proud of. I kind of talk about this, this dynamic, right? And so for one level, the need for tribes and municipalities to work together is at a premium. The other side of that is what you're asking about, is that I would actually like to see dialogues between cities and tribes. I would like to see both tribes and cities do a little historical work, right? I would like to see cities go into their history about how the city carved itself into the particular ecosystem. I'd like to see non-native people do research on how European cities historically were not actually based on the same models that we see in the United States, but were actually based on much more flexibility to ecological conditions. And then tribes, who almost always are already doing this research, come then with their models, like the seasonal models I was telling you about, and think about the regional supply chain together. And I think that would be powerful to use what we kind of call, in one of the fields I was trained in, these kind of counterfactual, or these historical situations that were very different from the ones we face today, and do joint scenario planning together. And so I would love to see, in areas where tribes and municipalities are close by, joint scenario planning informed by reconstructions of our history that present very different options for how we organize ourselves to adapt to climate change. But yeah, great question.
Well, thank you so much. That was probably the most energetic presentation we've ever had in our series, and hugely informative. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. And I think Kyle can stick around for a minute or two, but I know he hasn't eaten lunch, so there's that. But if you want to come say hi, that's probably fine. Thanks so much for joining us, and come to our next one, whenever that is.